I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Senators Bob Menendez and Patty Murray were joined by COVID-19 survivors to commemorate National COVID Week of Remembrance and Action on Wednesday at the U.S. Capitol. The senators urged Congress to pass additional COVID relief funding and to pass the Prevent Pandemics Act. This bipartisan piece of legislation aims to prepare for new and existing viruses. COVID was the third leading cause of death in the United States in 2021. Let's listen in.
Here to honor the nearly 1 million lives taken by COVID in the United States alone. I'm also here as the daughter of Kevin B. Taylor, a Washington, D.C. native, a patriotic American who served his country for more than 20 years in the United States Air Force, and then another 23 years managing social services offices in my home state of Delaware. My dad caught COVID while leading worship in a church conference where many people chose not to mask, during a time where masks were required. And unfortunately, in August of 2020, he died. He passed down his values, his character of service to me, which is one of the reasons why I'm an Air Force veteran who served in Iraq. After leaving the military, I had the honor and the pleasure to serve on President Biden's then Senate staff. And later, for a number of years, I took care of families of our military's fallen. It's why I've been such a passionate advocate for families like all of ours here today. I want to start with thanking Senator Murray and Senator Menendez, especially Senator Menendez's staff, who has been very instrumental and helpful to us as we have all planned for this week. We could not have done this without their support. Additionally, I want to thank each member of Congress who has come here to participate and pause from their sacred work on Capitol Hill to remember each one of our loved ones. I also want to thank each member of their staffs and other members of Congress who are holding meetings with our participants throughout the day. Each of you are listening, you're remembering, and you're taking action, and that's exactly what this week is about. Today we are all here to make our mark on history as we pause and we recognize almost 1 million lives lost to COVID. 1 million human beings with many family members who are grieving. We stand here united to send a powerful message to our nation and demand that our legislators strengthen prevention measures that will end this pandemic. Additionally, we are here to advocate for Senate Bill 3799, the passage of the Prepare for and Respond to Existing Viruses, Emerging New Threats, Prevent Pandemics Act, to include a congressional COVID task force. We are also running out of funds for life-saving programs. We need Congress to fund the full $22.5 billion needed to address domestic and global needs. This funding is critical for all Americans, and it requires bipartisan efforts. It will ensure that all Americans, even the uninsured, have access to COVID testing, vaccines, and life-saving antivirals. $22.5 billion. That might sound like it's a big, costly number, but it's not, because it will prevent us from going back in time to the way things were at the beginning of this pandemic. Like in 2020, when my dad was hospitalized, fighting for his life, and my family was told that it would take an act of God or be miraculous just for him to get plasma treatment because it was rare and so hard to find. This funding, and I'm going to say this as a combat veteran, this funding is just as critical as the funding that we're sending to war-torn Ukraine to help fight off Putin. In fact, this funding is like a targeted weapon that will no doubt save many American lives, and that is why we are all here today. Today we are joined with more than 30 organizations from all over our nation. Some of you standing here with me have come from as far west as Alaska and California to stand here united as we demand that direct funding go to programs for long haulers and families whose loved ones have died from COVID, especially the more than 200,000 children who have been orphaned because of COVID. We also need things like scholarships, baby bonds, financial support, and permanent memorials that will help ease the crushing burden and heartbreak that all of our families are facing. We are here to ensure that our loved ones' memories remain forever etched in our future and our children's future as we pause in a moment of silence to remember those who have fought valiantly against COVID. As we pause, I want you to remember that this war with COVID is not over. So we pause to remember those who are currently infected, like our nation's Vice President, Kamala Harris, or my brother from combat, who is currently battling COVID. We pause to remember those who are still battling the long-term impacts of COVID. And last but certainly not least, we will pause to remember those who, like my dad, valiantly fought as hard as they could and somehow still died as a result of COVID. This is what collective grief and healing looks like, and all of us, everyone in our nation, desperately needs that right now, more than ever. So as we pause, the next voice that you're going to hear will be Senator Murray. She has been such a strong supporter of our cause, and I'm so grateful that she took the time out of our day to speak and be present. Thank you. So we're going to pause, everyone, for a moment of silence or a moment of prayer, whichever you prefer.
Thank you, Shalandra. And thank you to Sabila, Pamela, and Chris, who are here today to give voice to so many people across the country, including people in Washington State, and to all of the families who are here with us today. The pain the COVID-19 pandemic caused has been unthinkable. Millions of people across the country have lost loved family members and cherished friends, and are grappling with a painful hole in their families or an empty chair at the dinner table. Over 200,000 kids have lost a parent, or even both, and had their lives completely shattered and turned upside down. Our communities have lost nurses and teachers, first responders, and so many friends and neighbors. And we've all lost valuable time with each other, time our kids and teachers needed to learn and teach in the classroom, at weddings and celebrations, and at times funerals to remember the people we lost and who we all miss so much. Countless people are struggling with a painful new reality, including the many people with long COVID who are learning how to live with a new disability, even as we still have a lot of work to do to understand how to help these patients. This pandemic has been heartbreaking on a scale beyond comparison, and to each of the families who are here today sharing their stories, please know I'm holding all of you in my heart. We've never been through something like this, and it's clear to everyone we have to never go through this again. And that means we must learn the lessons of this pandemic and take action so we are never unprepared again, which is why I am pushing for more COVID funding to make sure we continue to protect the progress we've made and get our communities the tools they need to keep our families safe for whatever comes next, tests, treatments, or vaccines. It's why I worked so hard to write the Bipartisan Prevent Pandemics Act, which strengthens our public health and preparedness system based on what worked and what did not in our COVID response, and passed that through our health committee in an overwhelming 20-2 bipartisan vote. And I am now pressing to get that signed into law. It's why I made sure that that bill included an independent task force modeled after the 9/11 Commission, which will conduct a thorough review of our response to the pandemic to make sure we get a full account of what went wrong, what we need to do to save lives the next time something like this happens. That was non-negotiable for me in this bill. In fact, it has been a priority for me since the earliest days of this crisis. I first actually called for this commission back in March of 2020. And I know it is a priority for Senator Menendez as well, who will be here shortly. He's been such a strong champion to get this done. We both understand how important this is because we both have been listening to families back home, back in Washington State or back in New Jersey. We have heard stories like the ones of all these incredible advocates who are sharing with us today. We know how much people have lost. We know how hard this has been. They say that those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And we know we simply cannot repeat this dark chapter of our history ever again. We owe it to everyone who is hurting to learn from this pandemic and to act. And we will not rest until we make sure that happens. Thank you.
Next, you will hear from Senator Menendez, who is on his way. He is coming from Secretary Madeleine Albright's funeral, so we are going to try to give him a couple more seconds to get here. But as we're waiting, I just want to say thank you. He has been such a staunch supporter of all of our families. He's been working hard, and we know that he is pushing forward the Prevent Pandemics bill that we are all cheering. So I'd like to introduce you to Senator Menendez.
Well, thank you, Sharonda, and I am sorry to be a few minutes late. We were at the funeral mass for the late Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, an extraordinary woman in her own right, and we certainly wanted to be there, as we want to be here with you. And I appreciate all of you creating spaces for others to heal. I appreciate my colleague, Senator Patty Murray, who I understood was here as well. Her leadership at the helm of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, and particularly as co-lead of the bipartisan Prevent Pandemics Act, strengthens our nation's public health and emergency response systems in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're gathered here today, as so many have had to gather these past 2 years, to mourn and remember the loved ones that we have lost. In the face of this trauma, which has lodged itself in every corner of our nation, we come together to grieve nearly 1 million souls lost to COVID-19. A horrific milestone we never thought possible when this pandemic first started. With this week of remembrance and action, we honor their memory, and in doing so, we seek to turn our pain into purpose, our grief into growth. Every life lost leaves behind a void that can never be filled, a place at the table that will always be empty, and a community of loved ones with broken hearts. It's especially personal for the survivors who join us today, like Sabila Khan. Before the pandemic, her father, Shafkat, was an advocate for immigrants and the founder of the nonprofit Pakistanis for America. He was a trusted resource for the different communities that have set down roots in Jersey City. At home, he was a loving father and grandfather with a heart of gold. On April 14th, at the height of the first COVID wave 2 years ago, Mr. Khan was taken from us. It's a familiar story for far too many families in my home state of New Jersey and others throughout the country who have had to endure the heartbreaking experience of losing a loved one to the pandemic. People from all walks of life, like Fairview Elementary School teacher Yvette Allers Ilisard, who left behind her husband and her 10-year-old son. Nurses like Daisy Doranilla, an immigrant from the Philippines, who worked for 2 decades at the Hudson County Correctional Center and was planning for retirement when she succumbed to the virus. First responders like Robert Weber, a volunteer firefighter with the Port Monmouth Fire Company for 15 years until he lost his battle with COVID in the first weeks of the virus. They represent a fraction of the more than 33,000 New Jerseyans we have lost, victims who share little in common except the deadly pandemic that took them from their loved ones far too soon. Studies have tried to measure the scale of this collective loss, concluding that for every person lost to COVID, 9 immediate family members have been affected. Think about that. 1 million Americans have been taken from us by the pandemic. 9 million more carry with them the invisible scars of immense grief as a result. They are sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, mothers, fathers, and grandparents alike. In bearing their burden, they are survivors themselves and have sought out others who similarly share their pain. As elected leaders, it's incumbent on us to channel their hope in order to further their healing. We must draw strength from their solidarity, keeping their stories front and center. In doing this, we can honor the victims, learn from our nation's response, and find ways to prevent a tragedy like this from never happening again. With my colleagues across the aisle, I've been proud to introduce a bill that does this through a national coronavirus commission. Modeled after the one set up in the wake of September 11th, it would investigate what went wrong and how we can better prepare for the next pandemic. This commission isn't just necessary to improve our nation's readiness, it is a vital first step to give the millions of American families some answers and some closure. Last month, when Senator Murray's Prevent Pandemics Act was introduced, it included language for a national COVID-19 task force modeled after my commission. Crucially, it will explore the stark health and economic disparities which led to minority and low-income communities bearing the brunt of this pandemic. It is my hope that Congress will act quickly so we can send it to President Biden's desk. Simply put, the families who are here with us today and who are watching from around the country deserve nothing less. So let me all ask you to think about that for a moment. Where we were in those early days, the chaos of conflicting information, the measures taken to flatten the curve, alleviate the burden on overworked healthcare workers, the persistent fear that you, your children, your parents, and loved ones would be infected and fall very ill to a virus we knew so little about. Imagine hearing that 2 years later, we'd be holding a week of remembrance for 1 million American lives lost. We can never, never become numb to these sobering facts. We must never tire in our efforts to deliver peace of mind for the families who lost a loved one to COVID. And so today, on this solemn occasion, let us hold each other close. Let us recommit ourselves to the work that lies before us so that every family, every person who has lost a loved one to this pandemic can feel the support of a community and a nation who will not let these deaths be in vain. Thank you very much for having me with you.
Next, I'd like to introduce you to a very special person who was personally instrumental in helping connect me with the COVID community. She's a dear friend of mine and someone I admired dearly. I first learned about the work she was doing shortly after my dad died when I was grieving alone. It was then that I stumbled across the Facebook group that she co-founded along with another young lady, Angelina, from New Jersey. That group, the COVID-19 Loss Support for Family and Friends, is one of the largest Facebook groups that supports survivors of COVID in the U.S. with more than 14,000 members. I'd like to introduce you to Sabila Khan.
My name is Sabila Khan, and I am one of the millions of Americans who have lost a loved one to COVID. My Abu Shafqat Khan was the loving father of 3, the doting grandfather of 7, and a devoted husband to my mother for 49 years. He founded a nonprofit called Pakistanis for America in Jersey City, New Jersey, and he spent years carving out spaces and opportunities for others. He was a good human being who devoted himself to his family and helped so many people talk beyond their differences and find common ground. On March 11th, 2020, as the tri-state area started to go into lockdown, the rehab facility where Abu was receiving physical therapy for Parkinson's closed its doors to visitors. We never saw him again. In early April, Abu was rushed to a hospital 3 blocks away from us. Days later, on April 14th, he died alone without his family by his side. Over 2 years later, and it still takes my breath away to imagine the fear, isolation, and trauma that Abu suffered during the last week of his life. It's something that will haunt me for the rest of mine. Abu was buried the following day, and in what was the most surreal and heartbreaking moment of my life, I had to watch his burial live streamed to my phone. But sadly, my story is not unique. When Abu died in April 2020, the COVID death toll in the US was 26,000. 2 years later, we've added almost 974,000 lives to that tally. How did we get here? What went wrong? The COVID bereaved are here today to demand answers. And let's not forget, COVID is not over. We are again seeing another uptick in COVID infections. People continue to die while others are permanently disabled. For every COVID death, there are an estimated 9 close family members left behind. That's almost 9 million Americans, many of whom have been left with PTSD, feelings of guilt and anxiety, lack of closure, and the burden of knowing that their loved ones died traumatized, isolated, alone. No family deserves this. In trying to navigate my own trauma, I took the lessons I learned from my community activist father, and 4 days after he died, I co-founded with Angelina Proya, who's right here, COVID-19 loss support for family and friends, the first Facebook bereavement group for people dealing with COVID loss. We're now the largest COVID loss support group in the country, with more than 14,000 members from all 50 states. We come from diverse backgrounds and political affiliations. Our group includes Trump and Biden supporters. And in spite of our differences, most of us would agree that a COVID task force is urgently needed. Today, we thank Senators Menendez, Burr, and Murray for their leadership. We believe that a nonpartisan, independent, equitable, fully funded, comprehensive, and fair COVID task force must center the voices, experiences, and needs of the communities most gravely impacted by this virus. Not only the bereaved, but also frontline healthcare workers and COVID long haulers. We must take a full and unvarnished look at what happened and why, so that we can fully understand how to make sure it never happens again. We demand support from both sides of the aisle for this, because if COVID has shown us anything, it's that viruses don't discriminate across party lines. We expect the findings to set into motion legislation and best practices that will save lives. And while none of the findings will change the fact of how our loved ones died, a COVID task force can bring so many families some measure of closure and healing. I want to add something here. Prior to Abu dying, I never really spoke about the fact that my family and I were undocumented for nearly a decade in the U.S. after arriving in the U.S. in 1982. Even so, Abu was obsessed with American politics. He studied the platforms of candidates in local and national elections, followed primaries and debates. He encouraged others to vote even though he himself couldn't vote in a presidential election until 2000. He raised us to believe in this country and in the political process. I'm here to honor Abu and his unwavering hope in this nation and in its government. I'm hopeful that Congress will pass a COVID task force as part of the Prevent Pandemics Act so that the deaths of 1 million Americans will not be forgotten. I am hopeful that we will be able to take the difficult lessons learned during this pandemic and apply them towards building a safer and more equitable nation for all. Thank you.
Next, we will hear from Melanie Marr. She's from Maryland. In 2019, she and her husband, along with their 6 children, worked together to operate a catering business with food trucks. Her husband died from COVID in February of 2021. Melanice?
Good afternoon. I find it an honor and a privilege to be given an opportunity to share my story during this National COVID Week of Remembrance and Action. My name is Melanice Marr Thomas, and I am currently a resident of Prince George's County in Maryland. I am a COVID survivor. I am also a mother, a sister, a daughter, and an aunt, a friend, and I am also a widow. So I am here today to speak my husband's name, Charles Thomas Jr., to tell his story, to tell our story, and to provide context to what others see as only numbers on a screen. December 2020, my entire family contracted COVID. My husband's symptoms were the worst. He was hospitalized for over 7 days. In fact, he was just hours away from being placed on a ventilator. But his oxygen levels rose, and he was released before Christmas. We thought we had escaped the worst. However, my world changed forever. On February 28th, 2021, my day started with the love of my life by my side and ended with the paramedics saying, "I'm sorry, there's nothing else we can do." At that moment, I went from a wife about to celebrate 10 years of marriage in Jamaica to a widow planning her husband's celebration of life service. I went from a co-owner of a business to a sole owner, trying to catch my breath and grasp the concept of doing this thing called life without my funny, loving, hard-working husband. I went from a woman full of plans to a woman reorganizing, shifting, adjusting, and accepting my new reality. There were days and hours I wanted to die and even felt like I would not take my next breath. That's the heaviness of grief. It snatches hope, joy, sleep, and life. My granddaughter only had 3 years to get to know her pop-pop. My husband will not see his new grandson due in a matter of weeks. My daughters will never have their father and stepdad walk them down the aisle. My husband will never see our sons graduate from high school or college. This pandemic has disproportionately impacted the African American community, and I stand as one of many affected by this faceless pandemic. I stand here because I refuse to allow it to remain faceless anymore. I stand with all of these individuals who grieve and mourn the loss of their loved ones. I stand with individuals who are facing unknown futures due to symptoms they still battle long after their initial infection. I know I am not alone in my grief and loss. We as a nation collectively grieve the nearly 1 million people lost to COVID-19. We must use our sadness and grief as catalysts for change. As we collectively grieve, we must collectively act. We must use our voice and our resources to ensure Congress passed the bipartisan Prevent Pandemics Act, to include a congressional COVID task force. We are also calling for full COVID-19 emergency federal funding for domestic needs. Winston Churchill said, "Those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it." Please don't let my husband's death and nearly 1 million other individuals' death be in vain. We must say their names. We must remember, and we must never forget. We must act now. Thank you.
Next, we will hear from Nicole Sperry. Nicole is one of America's mission essential workers and heroes that often goes unrecognized. She's a 5th grade teacher from Virginia who lost her 10-year-old daughter to COVID, and since then started a vaccine awareness page in honor of her daughter. As a mom who spent an entire year virtually last year with my own child, I want to make sure that I personally thank her for taking time from her classroom to be with us today, but also for enduring the turbulent experiences that I know many educators have had to endure during this pandemic. I cannot imagine how difficult it must be to continue serving as a teacher after suffering such an immeasurable loss. So Nicole, from one mom to another, thank you for all you were doing at such a time as this. I'd like to introduce you all to Nicole Sperry.
Thank you, Sharonda. I'm Nicole Sperry, and I'm here representing the members of parents who have lost a child to COVID-19. I assist in moderating the group with Amber and Amanda. You know, I've always imagined speaking at a press conference like this. You know, as a kid, you have these big dreams. Oh, I'm going to speak in front of the government one day. But I never thought it would be at the expense of my child and my heart. Our daughter Teresa was just 10 years old and died on September 27th, 2021 from COVID-19, approximately 1 month before the vaccine was available for her age range. Teresa was one of approximately 1,000 children under the age of 18 that have been taken away from us, not counting the parents that have lost their adult children. So many of the victims of COVID go nameless. These victims include those still battling with long COVID, that have had to have organ transplants because of the damage to their bodies, and those that have been left behind to pick up the pieces after our family members have gone from us. Much like my sons, they are suffering in their own ways at the loss of their only sister. We've shared Teresa's story many times in the short and long 6 months since she died. She was my mini-me, our diva. She never met a person that wasn't her friend. She had words of kindness for strangers in the store, complimenting them on something as simple as their shirt. I didn't make her do that. She loved music and art, and we would sing songs in the car or while watching movies like The Greatest Showman. She loved life and had so many dreams and goals that she wanted to accomplish that I sometimes wondered how she was going to get them done. But I knew that she was just as stubborn as me, that she could do it. We took as many precautions as possible to protect our family from COVID, not because we were worried about her, but because of my husband. He suffers from many medical conditions that put him, like so many of my friends that I have, at high risk. We avoided going to certain places as much as possible. Wherever we went, we wore our masks. Our kids only went back to school in person this school year because we were trying to keep the risk low. I was able to get my vaccine first, then Jeff, my husband, and when the vaccine was available for our teenagers, they got it. Then we felt it might be okay to send our 4 kids back to school. Teresa missed seeing her friends and being in school. She was a giver, and if asked to do anything, she would do it to help. Little did we know that within weeks of her going back to school, she would get sick and just 5 days later, die. I stand in front of you today to ask our government for an independent COVID task force. We need to work together as a nation to try to make sure that we do not have to go through another tragedy that will lead us to another million innocent lives taken from us. COVID is not a political virus. It is not attacking one political party or another. It is attacking those with health conditions as well as people who used to run marathons. We need more work to address the effects of long COVID. Too many survivors are fighting to get the help they need to get medical tests because their insurance won't cover them. We need to support our healthcare workers with the tools, funding, and infrastructure needed. we should also honor the lives lost with a national memorial for people like Teresa. They do not deserve to go nameless. We must find ways to support the children that have been affected by losing their mother, father, brothers, and sisters. Thank you.
Next, you will hear from Maya. Maya is from New York. She was impacted very early in this pandemic. In March of 2020, she became one of the first young women infected with COVID. To put it lightly, she has endured a long and bumpy road just to be here with us today. She's been a strong advocate for long haulers and most recently advocated to introduce a bill into the New York legislature that would provide scholarships for children who've died of COVID. I'd like to introduce you all to Maya McNulty.
What an honor to stand here today. Good afternoon. And thank you, COVID survivors, for change, and everyone here for attending the National Remembrance and Week of Action for our beloved friends, family, lost to COVID. We acknowledge the unimaginable death toll of over 1 million lives lost to COVID and 220,000 children who have been orphaned by COVID and this mysterious long COVID shadow pandemic. 765 days. That's how long it's been since I was struggling with 99 of the 200 COVID long haul symptoms, such as cognitive dysfunction, chronic cough, neuropathy, insomnia, shortness of breath, heart palpitations, fatigue, tinnitus, and pains in both my hands and my feet. I'm Maya McNulty from Schenectady, New York. I'm the New York State captain for COVID Survivors for Change, and I'm totally honored to do that job. I have worked in support for a scholarship and baby bonds bill that was already drafted and introduced by Assemblyman Angelo Santabarbara, New York State Assembly. I'm the author of several books. I'm a mom, a wife, a daughter. Pre-COVID, I was a high-achieving entrepreneur, and I've worked with thousands of people for more than 2 decades, creating jobs and opportunities. I battled the coronavirus March of 2020. I was one of the first young females infected. I was hospitalized for 69 days and was in a 30-day medical-induced coma on a ventilator and trached for 6 weeks. As a COVID long hauler, I've had to learn how to walk, talk, and eat all over again. I lost all of my hair and my voice for 10 months, and I'm still recovering steadily. I've turned my pain into potential and created COVID Wellness Clinic, an online program to help long haulers from the comfort of their own home. COVID Wellness is dedicated to the support and education of families and individuals living with serious and debilitating long COVID. Would it be okay if I shared a story? I can best remember while laying in my hospital bed, the pain I felt, the shards of glass attacking my entire body and my skin, my organs. The isolation and the darkness and the hopelessness that I felt, that I couldn't see my family, my husband, my daughter, my parents. It was 69 days of heartbreaking. I was told that my daughter flew home from college to say goodbye to her mom via Zoom. All 3 of my lungs, and I had to learn that I had 3 lungs. I thought I only had 2, but all 3 had collapsed, and I died of respiratory failure. This is one of the most tearful and painful memories. Under the care of medical professionals, I've regained lung function of 70% in the past 25 months. I know that my story makes me look and feel like one of the lucky ones, but sometimes I don't really feel lucky. I know that at the dinner table worldwide, that there are millions of empty chairs. These chairs belong to our loved ones. They are not just a number. 2 years after the pandemic begun, and I was the first sick, 1 million long haulers are suffering the aftermath. I'd like to share a few of their stories with you today as well. Too many whom have been overlooked by their doctors and our healthcare system. Dr. Robbie Tarango from Florida. She's a clinical psychologist in the Navy. She contracted COVID while caring for one of the patients who's still in active duty. She is no longer able to return to the Navy or her private practice. Cynthia Adding from Northern Virginia. She's been to the emergency room more than 30 times in the past 2 years. Another long hauler was Another long hauler was told by her dentist that long COVID is not a real disability. Robin Burke from Oklahoma struggles with vision issues, brain fog, neuropathy, and despite this, she continues to work with veterans. She treats inpatient psychiatric units because she is seeing a staggering increase in the need for mental health and funding. We are asking Congress to pass the bipartisan Prevent Pandemic Act, the bill numbers S.3722. That would include a congressional COVID task force. We're also calling for COVID-19 emergency federal funding for Americans. In New York State, we are working to support some of the country's estimated 220,000 children orphaned by COVID. By advocating for scholarships and baby bonds, these children also need our help. Finally, we need healthcare education and funding so that medical communities can diagnose and treat long COVID. Thank you today. I appreciate you all.
Next, we will hear from Martha Romero. Martha has traveled all the way from California to be with us today. Her family, like many other families impacted by COVID, suffered some catastrophic blows. I'll let her tell you her story now, which hopefully will provide you a window into the souls of many families who have been shattered by COVID. Martha?
Good afternoon. My name is Martha Romero, and as Sharonda mentioned, I am here from California. My parents caught COVID in July of 2020. Fortunately, my special needs brother who lived with them did not get sick. He stayed with me while both of our parents fought to recover. They lived 2 hours away from us. Little did I know that in July of 2020, I would go to war with COVID. It walked right into my family's life, right into my life, stared me in the face, and I began to start fighting for my dad, my mom's, and for life and for the safety of my brother. I remember my mom calling me to give me her goodbyes, to give me instructions on how to care for my brother, all while my dad was in the hospital fighting COVID. A few weeks later, my dad did the same thing, called me desperate because he couldn't breathe on a CPAP machine, saying, "I can't handle this." My mom was able to come home. She still suffers from long-haul COVID. As you've heard stories here, she has brain fog. She has other issues. Unfortunately, my dad fought COVID 1 week shy of 6 months. Limited visits and FaceTime calls allowed us to have what would now be my last moments with my dad, Jose de la Cruz Romero Mercado. After 3 different discharge dates, he took a turn for the worst at the end of January. January 28th, the day that my world went dark. The day I didn't see coming, the call I didn't expect to receive on that rainy California night. Moving forward 9 months later, on his 85th birthday, COVID would again stare my family in the face and take my grandfather, Modesto Emilio Palacio Reyes, away from us, all the way in Nicaragua. In 2021, my family lost our foundations. We lost those that made us feel protected, especially my brother. My brother looked up to my dad so much for protection. And as I mentioned, my mom survived, yet still struggles with long COVID. You may not hear from us or about our war stories because what we have seen and experienced is too painful. I have pictures that I cannot find to share with anyone. And as of today, it's been a year and it's been 15 months and we have not been able to bury my dad's ashes. I remember the night he passed away, I called 9 different mortuaries to try to find a place that could pick up his body. That is not what I was thinking of doing after I got that call. 2 months later, I received his ashes. I went to bed every single night knowing that my dad was in a storage container full of bodies, just wishing that I could sit there and just be with him, see him one last time. The last picture I have of my dad was me with my Cal Poly Pomona school t-shirt. And I told him, Dad, you have to make it home because I want you to walk with me. I want you to be there when I graduate. I am a year away from graduation, and it is difficult to know that this milestone, a big milestone in my life, is going to happen and he's not there. On a lighter note, I'd like to share great moments that I had with my dad. I loved taking him to the opera. One of our favorite times was taking him to see Plácido Domingo. And we would watch soccer matches together. World Cup was our favorite time. His favorite team was Brazil. And I remember anytime World Cup would come, he would start prepping my mom the day before church and say, I'm tired. I might stay home. And as it comes up, it just makes me feel like that void is there. That father-daughter time is no longer there. My grandfather had a stern voice, a presence. We joked that he kind of was a godfather figure. And it's difficult to go along and live every day with triggers surrounded. And as mentioned, this is not a political thing. When my dad was on the ventilator, that ventilator didn't ask if he was Republican or Democrat. It didn't ask that. The machine was there pumping oxygen into his lungs. So as we stand here today, we ask you, and as we get to that milestone of 1 million families, after every name, there's a story like mine that needs to be shared and needs to be heard. Their stories matter. They fought with all they had to come home. They also deserve a place to be remembered. And we also need to pass acts like the Prevent Pandemics Act. Our healthcare system, all the people that are sick, the people that are left behind, it is very important that these pass. Because now is the time, we don't know when the next pandemic is going to hit. Maybe in our lifetime, maybe not. But this is a time to pause and say, what are our lessons learned of everything that we have gone through? Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Martha. I want to pause for a moment before I say anything else. Everyone here has shared personal stories, transparent stories. Stories that are courageous to tell in light of what's happening right now in our country. Many of us have family members who don't want to talk about the fact that our loved ones died of COVID. There are many people in this country right now who are grieving, who you may never know, have lost their loved ones to COVID. What we're asking for in light of what has happened in this pandemic in America is small. It's not big, it's small in light of all the stories that you've heard. These stories that you've heard today are a very small portion of the stories that we all know from people who have experienced COVID in our community. Next, I'd like to introduce Chris Kocher. Chris Kocher is a very humble man, but I'm going to praise him in this moment. He is the founder of COVID Survivor for Change, and he is the brains behind this operation today. I have seen this man do amazing things over the past month to make sure that we could all be here today. So, Chris.
Thank you, Sharonda. I just wanted to close out the press conference by thanking everyone for being here, especially Senators Menendez and Murray. And I especially want to thank everyone who's standing behind me, who shared their stories so beautifully, who talked not just about how their loved ones died, but how they lived, the lives that they've lived, the celebrations that they had together as families. We're here because we're reading some of the nearly 1 million lives that have been lost. And if we read one name per second, we would be here for more than 11 days. So we're here just for today, just to read some of the thousands of some of the names that have been lost. And to close out today, we're reading these names in front of the Capitol Reflecting Pool, and the live stream for there will resume at 3:30. But to take us into that next part of the program, I wanted to invite Nicole Sperry to come back and read some of the names of children who have died from COVID over the past 2 years. Thank you very much.
All right, so if I mess up any of these names, like they say, charge it to my head and not my heart. Aaliyah Outerbridge, Chad Dorrell, Johnny Probicki, L.J. King, Brianna Legg, Chris Pippins, Gabriella Blakely, Danny Catter, James and Joshua Andrus, Heather Buchanan, Braden Wilson, Rita Traylor, Eddie Hernandez, Stephen Heimer, Kyle Dixon, Sean Crawford. I have more. Lisa Jane Goldstraw, Brad Green, Matthew Newell, Quentin McCaskill, Donovan Kittle, Lyle David Hobart, Freddie Garza, Brittany Lynn Bodzak, Frank Miller, Jordan Kempers, Jeremy King, Tiffany Civilli, David Caballero, Jeremy Martinez, Zach Leventon, Jennifer Shiflett, Hannah Mansell, Justin Reiber, Alec Witten, Anthony Velez, Bradford Green, Nick Hertz, Amanda Brame, Hasten Mathis, Ricky Robertson, Alberto Valencia, Michaela Jones, Randy Betts, Adam Russo, Michael Allen Schroger, Ramon Peterson, Harley Koloff, Tanner and Derek Preston, Jordan Franklin, Sean Crawford, Chelsea Richardson, Alexandra Chandler, Levi Keffer, Ian Ritzer, Robert Hape, Terrence Cooper, Joey Perez, Sarah Ann Shahanan, Trent Morgan, Victor Reyes, Benjamin Mahone, and Christian Umani. Thank you.
We'd like to thank all of you for watching and attending and your participation today. This concludes our press conference. Thank you all.